Okay. We're going to do Jeremy Bentham today. Yay! It's hard for me not to render Bentham a little bit comically, and you'll see why, if you don't already know him. He was a person who was absolutely obsessed with a conviction, the conviction that he had found the root of all human behavior and all institutions in one simple principle called utility. But the irony was that Bentham was also a person, despite his conviction that he had found this principle and that it was very simple and that it explained everything, he was a person who couldn't, in his own writing and in his own life, ever express himself at all. His writing is incredibly tortured. He wrote reams and reams and reams every year, and he couldn't finish most of his projects. And most of his writing was fairly unreadable. He had to hire other people to translate it into readable and legible prose. Bentham also invented hundreds of schemes for social and political improvement. Things like a design for the Panama Canal, the perfect prison, speaking tubes, the early prototype of the telephone, plans for freezing vegetables. He was one of those crazed guys who was just always inventing stuff, most of which didn't come to fruition. He was also, as I'll suggest in more detail in a few minutes, a person who had the idea to have himself entombed as what he called the auto-icon of the utilitarian movement, and his stuffed head sits today in a box, kind of like a phone booth, if that still is a signifier that makes any sense, at the end of a very long hall at the University of London. So Bentham is obsessive, a little bit lunatic, and if it were not the case that he had come to have such a strong hold on modern political thought, and that utilitarianism had not come to have such a strong purchase in contemporary life, he might be remembered today as just one of those crazy guys carrying on out there in Sproul Plaza or elsewhere, who could only see the rightness and the brilliance of his own thought and who was always obsessed with another variation on it. The feature of utilitarianism that persists, that has to do with Bentham's character, is, I think, that for people who are captured by it, who do come to believe in it, it has that blinding quality. It is a principle which becomes absolute and blinding. It admits of no other. And we're going to spend a little time trying to fathom that dimension of utilitarianism, why it seizes hold in the way that it does. But first, let me give you just a quick story of Bentham's life. He was born in 1748. We're reading him out of chronological order because of, as you'll see as the weeks progress, his close relationship to John Stuart Mill. And so we need to read him now, right next to Mill. He was the descendant of London barristers. He was destined for a high position in the law. He was educated at Oxford, but he did not engage in the kind of drinking, sporting life that Marx had engaged in his college life. And he graduated at 16 from college, and then spent long periods in a room at a farm outside of London, where he studied from sunrise until sunset, and where he also performed a lot of strange chemistry experiments. Things occasionally blew up in that room. He was self-identified as a hermit. And he did study law briefly. Remember, that's what his parents wanted him to do. But he abandoned that idea fairly quickly in favor of becoming a legal scholar. Got fascinated by the idea of doing legal scholarship and especially legal reform. Somehow in his early 20s, he fell in love. Happens to all of us, even the really nerdy ones. But he fell in love with a pauper, and of course that meant he had to support her and write something sellable. So he wrote a comment on Blackstone's legal commentaries, and that became the basis of the fragment on government, which you're wading through a bit of for today. And that's where he first launched the utility principle. And this is also going to be emblematic of how Bentham always works, starting out a magnum opus that ends up being kind of a fragment and unfinished. But this fragment caught the interest of the Earl of Shelburne, who was a politician on the progressive side, and he brought Bentham into his intellectual and political circle. He kind of adopted him. Bentham became intensely engaged with the French Revolution, like everybody we've studied so far in this class, and he wrote a stream of pamphlets aimed at instructing the French. Through this activity, he met his great editor, Dumont, who took Bentham's big manuscripts, by this time there were lots of them, and tried to render them readable in French. In 1791, Bentham began a 20-year struggle to persuade the British government to let him build what he presented to them as the Panopticon. I'll talk about it more at the end of today if we have time. It was an idea for a prison, but also for managing the whole of the British underclass. And he poured all of his own inheritance into the design and the plans for this prison. But what he lacked was the land and the contract with the state to build it. He came close several times to getting both and to getting that contract, but each time some interested political party quashed it, and that helped to shape Bentham's own feeling that government tended to always be fouled by non-utilitarian interests and that it needed to become more utilitarian in its order and orientation. But we don't know what that means yet. We just know that that's what Bentham thought. We'll find out in a few minutes. Put another way, the experience with the prison project made him really disgusted with all forms of authority that were not rooted in a rational utilitarian approach. And in a peculiar way, this experience moved him to the left, not a socialist left, but a left of a kind of anti-government, anti-authoritarian, anti-authority sort. At the age of 42, where his 2 decades of efforts at law reform and prison reformation had come to naught, his manuscripts lay in huge piles, his genius was utterly unrecognized in England, he was pretty discouraged and pretty depressed, and oddly, this led him to decide to run for Parliament, which failed. And then he returned to work on the Panopticon and a bunch of other projects. But in the early 1800s, those French translations that editor had been helping him with finally started getting some notice, and then Bentham got some acolytes, people who believed he did have the truth, and they helped him render his prose intelligible in English, and they became his secretaries, and they began issuing a quarterly journal of his writings. And at that point, his ideas finally started to have some influence in both law and politics. And of course, this led him to become more frenzied in his work, and he started developing blueprints for everything: constitutional law, representative democracy, education, the church, the family, everything. And he became the spiritual leader of his own sect. So he had followers who tried to live according to his political and philosophical ideas, something that will become really important when we get to John Stuart Mill. These were variously named the philosophical radicals. Sometimes they just called themselves utilitarians. Most often they just called themselves Benthamites. And this circle included James Mill, father of John Stuart. Okay, let's just get this life wrapped up. How did his head come to sit at the end of a hallway at the University of London? Well, one of Bentham's projects was to figure out how the dead could be made useful to the living. And he also felt that his own sect needed an enduring icon. And he wanted it to be a very cost-beneficial, efficiency-maximizing icon. And he thought the best way this could happen would be not to build a statue in his memory or something like that, but just to have his own body embalmed and mounted. As he put it, people should be representatives of themselves. Statues are costly and imperfect facsimiles. Now, unfortunately, despite all the research he had done into head shrinking and embalming, it was a massive failure, and you can imagine what an embalming failure looks and smells like. He looked so horrible a few months after the head had been embalmed and stuffed that it had to be replaced by a commissioned wax facsimile. So the clothes and the skeleton and the walking stick represented themselves, but the head could not. Bentham's head couldn't finally make itself useful, realize its own end, or represent itself. Okay, that's Bentham's story, sort of. There's much more. If you really want, well, if you want to know, how to get more biographical detail, I can give that to you. Let's go to Bentham's way of knowing, Bentham's epistemology. We do this with each theorist. With each theorist, we have to ask just not what are their ideas, but what do they claim their ideas are based on? How do they claim to know what they know? What's the structure or the evidentiary basis or the theory of knowledge on which their ideas rest? Bentham himself coins the phrase art and science, hyphenated. Why? Well, he doesn't believe in a precise science of things, of human things. Sorry, he believes in a precise science of non-human things, but not of human things. And his chief metaphors for his social and political theory are drawn from medicine, which he also believes is a combination of art and science. Now, he's hardly the first political theorist to do this. Pre-Socratics, Plato, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Nietzsche, all of them will use medical metaphors. Bentham takes this quite far. He believes the whole extant system of law and politics was, as he put it, choked with poisons. Corruption, lies, nonsense, irrationality. He describes the nation as sick, plagued, swollen with gout and cholera. He speaks of the English body politic more generally as, and I'm quoting him, afflicted with ruinous injury, running sores, deformity, and foul nakedness. And he refers to Blackstone's jurisprudence, the jurisprudence that was taken as gospel at the time, as injecting poison into our eyes. And he refers to himself as taking a scalpel to Blackstone's work. So, this already tells us that Bentham's work with a medical metaphor won't simply be that of diagnosing or mapping and coding, but rather diagnosing and then healing. That's the art that will be conjoined with the science. The science is the diagnosis. The physician's art is that of healing. So he understands his work to involve the project of developing an exhaustive anatomy, in his case, a complete code of law and critique of existing law, and then producing large-scale preventative and therapeutic social medicine. And I'm putting the accents on all those words, preventative and therapeutic social medicine. So he wants to bring an end to all the ills and toxins and deformities with a form of government, including a form of social regulation and control, that will be healing as well as preventative. It will be therapeutic. Now, it's important to grasp that this picture of moral and political health is achieved through a therapeutic metaphor and a therapeutic understanding of what political theory and political practice is to do. It will not, in other words, involve repressive, oppressive, despotic, or otherwise overt power forms to leash and control people. Instead, we are entering with Bentham the age of behaviorism, of altering behavior and conduct through governing subjects. Remember here what Tocqueville so worried about, that freedom might simply pass from the world as we become more and more well-behaved, self-absorbed, pleasure-seeking little atoms in a mass that is administered. Well, this is the very operation that Bentham himself aims to perform and perfect. This very thing that Tocqueville so dreaded is what Bentham is trying to perform and perfect through his conviction that human beings can be manipulated through their desires, that human beings can be organized through their interests, that they can be controlled through their attractions and their aversions. So what Bentham is going to do eventually, we're not there even close to this yet, is figure out how to use what he understands as basic human psychology as a form of governance that manipulates and organizes and controls us without having to use despotic or oppressive or repressive measures. And Bentham is really shameless in his enthusiasm here. In part because his moral and political conviction is that political order exists solely to promote the general happiness. So if he can manipulate and organize and orchestrate our desires such that we are happy, then he hasn't done anything wrong to us. And a good political order must be one that manipulates us well in order to produce our happiness. Now, to be clear, I'm still just kind of introducing him, getting you used to him a little bit. He's not indifferent to those basic watchwords of democracy, liberty, equality. But they're not the building blocks of a good order for him. And he knows they can mean lots of different things. So if they're part of what make us happy, if we want liberty and equality, fine, then the legislator's task is to produce them through law and social controls and produce us in a way that we use them properly. The point is, liberty and equality are not sacred values for Bentham. Their achievement also does not rest in rights or participation. So Bentham's neither a liberal nor a Republican in the classical sense. He famously refers to rights as nonsense on stilts. Doesn't believe in them as viable, legitimate things. And he famously understands political participation as a norm that, as he puts it, makes no sense. It's important to grasp this aspect of utilitarianism as we begin to descend into him. And it's especially important to grasp this aspect of utilitarianism because utilitarianism is, in a reshaped form, fundamental to contemporary neoliberal rationality. It's fundamental to it. So to grasp that democracy, equality, those watchwords of democracy are not really that important and are being displaced by Bentham, and I would suggest by neoliberal rationality today, by a concern with maximizing the interests or the pleasures of individuals and then the aggregate, regardless of what kind of manipulation or control or regulation of those desires is at stake. That's important for us to grasp. Okay, so let's get to utility. And if you have a copy of the text with you, it will really help you. If you don't, that's all right. I know it was ecological to leave it on the screen. But if you have a copy, I'm going to work pretty closely, starting on page 85. So I'll give you a moment to get it if you've got it. On page 85, where Bentham introduces the principle of utility, he introduces it with this sentence. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Let me just read it again. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. So he starts by telling us, essentially, nature has given us an inescapable condition. We're placed under two sovereign masters. We are controlled by these masters as subjects. But this sentence also tells us that these masters are not just above us, They're in us. These sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, our desire to avoid the one and have the other, operate from inside us. It's really crucial because that's going to make them key instruments of social control. Okay, that was the first sentence. Nature's placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters. And as I've suggested, they're sovereign, they're absolute, they control us completely, and they also are inside us. He continues, it is for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as determine what we shall do. It's for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as determine what we shall do. So they are really our masters. They determine what ought to happen and what will happen. In other words, they're not just inescapable as sovereigns, they also have a moral claim. They point out what's right as well as what's merely possible. They point out what we ought to do as well as determine what we shall do. So we're already moving really fast here in developing this principle of utility. We've moved from governance, masters that are inside us, and we've moved from governance to moral rectitude, what ought to be. It's a crucial move for Bentham. The strange breed of morality that these sovereign masters have, he's going to use to overthrow all other moral claims. Nothing else will have bearing. They are our only masters. They're the only ones that can be listened to, that should be listened to, or that in fact ever really are listened to. Everything else, from dictates about the good or about sin or about failure, everything else for him is undercut and delegitimated by these two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. Okay, let's keep going. Bentham says, on the one hand, this is like a phrase that continues from the previous sentence. These masters point out what we ought to do as well as what we shall do. He says, on the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. So on the one hand, standards of right and wrong, and on the other, chains of cause and effect are fastened to the throne of these sovereign masters. So everything is tied to our desire for pleasure and desire to avoid pain. They determine what's right, they determine what's real, they determine what's true. Or put another way, because they determine what's real, the chain of cause and effect. Why did you do that? Because I wanted it. It was pleasurable. Why did you do that? Because I wanted to avoid pain. I didn't want that to happen. So not only do they determine what's right and what's real, they also determine what's real as the chain of cause and effect because they are the only measure of what's right and true. Any other standard of rightness, he is saying, challenges their sovereignty illegitimately, and any other standard of rightness is also impotent against the real. If you really try to persuade people to do the right thing against the pleasure-pain matrix, it's really, in the end, going to be a failure. Let's see how he goes on. They govern us, these two sovereign masters, in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection to them will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. So no matter what you try to do to show that you are not just yanked about, governed, owned by the desire for pleasure and the desire to avoid pain, everything else you do will just demonstrate and confirm that they really own you. In words, he says, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality, he'll remain subject to it all the while. So, now we know these masters are total. They shape everything about us, everything we say, everything we think and do. Now also it seems they have empire, not just governance. They own everything, whole world. And remember, they live within us, not just above us. And chasing after any other values will just always return us to this one. Chasing after anything else is delusional. He says next, the principle of utility, that's his principle, that's his discovery, that's what we're now creeping up on, recognizes this subjection. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection to these absolute imperial masters, and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Now remember, this manuscript was already improved, so this is what we're up against, is trying to sort through this writing. Okay, what is he saying here? That Bentham's governance principle is the only thing that takes measure of this reality, who we're really subject to. It's the only principle in accordance with it. So it must be the foundation of any moral, political, legislative, juridical, social, or economic system. It has to be at the bottom of any system for human beings, if such systems are going to be right, true, and good. But there's even more going on in this sentence, I think. He's also suggesting that this system has an object, any social system has an object, and it's an object that is in accord with these two masters, but it really tilts toward the pleasure master, because the object of any social system must be to obtain happiness defined as maximized pleasure. Happiness defined as maximized pleasure. That's what we want as individuals, and that's what any social system that organizes us must base itself on. Now, just a note here, there's no straightforward reason why the master obtaining pleasure should be served more than the master pain. But it makes sense to Bentham, just intuitive sense to Bentham, that we seek pleasure over pain. He can't imagine otherwise. So it's not until we get to the latter half of our course with Freud and Nietzsche and others that we're going to overturn and complicate this, where we're going to start to see other formulations of the human psyche, yearnings for masochism, death wishes, constraint, self-destruction, all those complicated things that we have more or less come to embrace as dimensions of the human condition in our time. Back to Bentham. He also tells us in the sentence we just read, which I'll just read for you again, the principle of utility recognizes this subjection to the masters, assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. He's telling us what the tools of his formulation of social systems will be. Reason and law. We're going to use reason and law to use these masters to get us rightly organized. These are going to be the instruments that will produce happiness in accord with the fact that we are subjected by these masters, pleasure and pain. And then he adds, systems that attempt to question it, this principle of utility and these masters, deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. So any other system that starts somewhere else, that doesn't deal with the basic truth that we are run by these two masters, that they are total, that they are absolute, that they live within us, and that they are the truth of the human existence and experience and condition. Any other system which questions this deals in sounds instead of sense, caprice instead of reason, darkness instead of light. That is, any other system deals in the world of noise and intellectual nonsense and darkness. Now, darkness, of course, is what the Enlightenment promises to throw off. And Bentham is essentially saying, I finally figured out how to do it. I finally figured out how to bring us out of the dark ages and into the light. It's this principle of utility that will do it. Okay, but now we need to know what this principle is. We know it has something to do with these two masters. We know something about these two masters, but now on page 86, Bentham will offer his more precise definitions of utility. And the first, happily, because you're using an old copy of mine, is marked by number 1 in the side of the page. It's on 86, and it's the paragraph just below the indented material. And Bentham says that by utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. Okay, let's make that a little bit less wordy. Utility is basically going to say yay or nay to various things or experiences according to whether or not they promote the happiness of an interested party. That party can be an individual, it can be a group, it can be a community or a polity. So it's important to get from the beginning that Bentham is telling us the utility principle doesn't simply broker pleasures, doesn't simply try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. It does so on the basis of interest. If you don't care about something, you don't care about something that is not useful to you, and that means your pleasure or displeasure in it is irrelevant. So if I ask you all, would you like to abolish the next paper and just have all of your grade devolve onto, the third paper, and half of you just really don't care at all, we're not going to take the measure of your view into account. Okay, so far we know the principle is one that says yes or no to things according to whether they promote the happiness of something interested in them. But then just a little bit further, where he gets to Roman numeral 3, still on 86, he says, by utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. And watch that string of words. Benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, all lined up together. Or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. Okay, what this formulation tells us is that utility is not only about the pleasure and the pain of an interested party, it lies in objects. Objects could include actions or experiences or persons. It also could include what we more conventionally call objects of desire in the form of things. Now, what's the significance of the fact that utility is oriented to objects? It means that our pleasures and our pains come from elsewhere. Our sovereign masters are inside, but what we're having pleasure and pain about is mostly elsewhere, even as it's experienced from within. All right, so now we're in some really complicated territory because Bentham is proposing to build an entire political and social system based on how we individually feel about what happens to us. How we individually feel about what happens to us. Bentham knows we feel things in radically different ways. The property in the object may be consistent. The taste of the ice cream is what it is. But our experience of it, you hate it, I love it, is going to be diverse. So what are we up against? We're up against the question of the age. How do we organize and control and administer a population which, according to Bentham, lives by a single calculus, pleasure, pain. We all want pleasure, we all want to minimize pain. But each contributes differently to the material of the total calculation, what I love, you hate, and so forth. So here's where we are. Bentham has told us that there is a principle, very simple, takes the true measure of what is really true about us, and it's an absolutely hegemonic principle. It takes care of everything, and it is the basis on which every law and policy and organizational scheme shall be based. But as soon as he's pronounced that hegemony and simplicity, it's gotten really complex because we are all different in how we experience the things that we have in common. Now we need to enter this complexity. We can do it by considering a seeming paradox in Bentham. On the one hand, he tells us the only measure of utility, what really makes a thing useful, is its maximization of our happiness. But Bentham's no hedonist. We already know that from the way he spent his own life. He didn't just sleep until noon and then do whatever. He's no advocate of indulgent and wanton pleasures. And even when Bentham starts to list, as he does on 93, the sources from which pleasure and pain flow, this becomes really clear. He says these sources are physical, political, moral, and religious. And then when he details them even further, I'm not going to read this part, on 99, they have this huge range. The range of the pleasures goes from memory and expectation. We want to repeat what we already felt, or we have a hope or an anticipation of something we feel again. They also have to do with things like friendship and love and power and cruelty. So what kind of happiness exactly is Bentham talking about? Well, here's the problem. On the one hand, Bentham knows, and Bentham says, no one can dictate your happiness. Our subjective response to each kind of pleasure or pain has to be just taken at face value. I might get pleasure out of killing somebody. You might get pleasure out of saving somebody's life. I might love jazz. You might love Chopin or Radiohead. Someone might even love Justin Bieber. What do we do about this? We know Herbie Hancock and Chopin and Radiohead are deeper and richer than Justin Bieber. We know that, but what does Bentham have to say about this? Well, he's divided. He famously remarked, pleasure for pleasure, pushpin, a form of gambling, a little minor form of gambling, is as good as poetry. Pleasure for pleasure, pushpin is as good as poetry. It's like Justin Bieber or McDonald's is as good as Chez Panisse or Herbie Hancock. On the other hand, given his calculus for measuring pleasure, it becomes really clear that eating at McDonald's or video gaming away your life is not going to add up to the same value as years of study of Latin or a musical instrument or something else. How does he get around this? Well, on page 96, he gives us a bunch of things that measure pleasure and pain. And the things that measure both of them, and just think pleasure here for a moment, are intensity, duration, relative certainty, fecundity, purity, and extent. So it's hard to say that a Big Mac has those qualities: intensity, duration, fecundity, purity, extent. It's, at best, brief or impure, has no ability to reproduce a pleasure, no effect beyond your own appetite sated, and probably a lot of dismal ones, both for the cow and for you. Now, presumably, the mastery of a musical instrument or language or something else allows you then to repeat the pleasure of making music again and again, communicating with a broader world, reading other literatures. It lets you do that for yourself, for others, etc. So that's how Bentham stays out of pure, cheap hedonism. But don't mistake that move for a moral valuation of one object above another. He still won't do that, because what he's calculating is utility. And utility is based on its capacity to produce enduring, repeated, certain, pure, and extensive pleasure. But if you want that Big Mac, or if you want to spend your evenings with an Xbox, Bentham's not going to condemn it. On the other hand, Bentham's not saying that only what's palpably useful is a source of pleasure. So let me underscore this, because just as we had to kind of undo our conventional understandings of materialism and idealism and install other notions there, we have to do the same with utility. We have a common way of speaking of utility today where we talk about it as functionalism, like that's a utilitarian building because all it does is have the function of sheltering and heating and so forth, but it doesn't actually have any aesthetics, and we talk about certain furniture that way and so forth. But that's not the way that Bentham is using utilitarian. For Bentham, utility measures pleasure. But pleasure is not determined by what we call utility or functionalism. So utility just measures pleasure, even though Bentham's trying to get it to attach to these longer, more enduring, reproducible, let's call them pleasures that have a slightly higher quality than the fleeting, the wanton, and so forth. But really, in the end, he's not going to judge your pleasure. And of course, there's a certain relief in that. What he's allowing us to do is just figure out how to analyze and pursue our pleasures within the constraints that he outlines, which includes the impact of their effect on others. So what's Bentham done? He's really set loose the creature that has been birthed by capitalism. Just set her or him loose. Given it the new morality that it needs, as well as the calculus that can keep it from completely blowing its future by entirely indulging present whims. So, what's missing? Let's put it the other way around in what Bentham has given us. Remember that limited, narrow, despotically ruled human being that Tocqueville worried about, or the alienated, dominated, exploited one that Marx diagnosed? These are nowhere in Bentham's celebratory picture of the self-interested subject. He doesn't care about these things. He doesn't care about whether you're free to participate in ruling yourself with others in a constitutional government or democracy, as Tocqueville did. He doesn't care about domination and exploitation and all of that stuff. In his view, we are simply pleasure maximizers. That's what we are. And there's nothing really to say about us beyond that. All the high values that Tocqueville and Marx had about governing ourselves in common, achieving true human emancipation or true Republican freedom, getting substantive equality or titrating the tensions between the local and the national and so forth. Bentham tosses all of these in the dumpster. Those things are all moral preoccupations based on things other than the utility principle, and he already told us those other preoccupations are just dead wrong. That's what we learned when we started reading the passage on utility. There's no distinctly public good or common purposes or common ends or value to the political. So Bentham's really tossing a lot in that dumpster. There is in human life for him now only one question: how individuals can maximize their pleasure and minimize their pain. That's the only calculus for thinking about all social, political, and economic problems. So just to get the full measure of this, what Bentham's done in insisting on the principle of utility as absolutely overweening and using it as a hammer for all other systems of thought is eliminated, for example, the idea of natural human association as the basis of politics or society. There's no such thing as human association for him. Doesn't mean there's not friendship, doesn't mean there's not pleasure in joining things and all that, but human association and the naturalness of the political that we get from Aristotle forward, gone. He's also reduced freedom radically. All it is a utilitarian instrument. It's not about governance, public participation. It's not about the social contract. It's not about popular sovereignty. He's also eliminated all concerns with the nature of the good, the just, and the right, other than maximizing the pleasure of the many. So he's eliminated concerns with justice that are apart from the question of how to make us as happy as we possibly can be made. Now again, this probably doesn't sound so shocking because we're pretty used to it. That's more or less what we have in contemporary discourse, is a lot of this kind of talk. But before we get there, I want to note a problem in Bentham's formulation, which is that if you start with individuals as pleasure maximizers, we're all trying to maximize our pleasure, minimize our pain, and you eliminate morality and authority, you eliminate the idea of the social contract, promise keeping, every concern with res publica, the public thing. How do you order and govern us as a mass? How do you get us together? What's the binding force for holding human beings together and making them behave or get along? How do you keep them from killing each other or just anarchically destroying society? Well, the key will be to use those great sovereign masters very calculatingly for government itself. We're going to watch Bentham pull us into order by pulling on those things that live inside us. That's why I said this is the age of behaviorism we're seeing inaugurated here. So it's in the move we're about to make from the individual to the collective, to society, that we will see Bentham's utilitarianism, maximize pleasure, minimize pain, conjoined with behavioral manipulation or social control. So that's where we're going to go now. So we're at number 4. We're going to look at the principle and the ends of government. Legislation, for Bentham, is the ultimate moral science. And he's very excited about it because it requires applying the principle of utility to every kind of law and regulatory scheme. Bentham will supply it, as usual, with both a principle and a set of ends. The principle for all legislation is achieving the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Achieving the greatest happiness for the greatest number. What is this? Well, it's actually just the utility principle generalized to society. That is, it requires a calculus of our pleasures and pains that exactly replicates what we do on an individual level all the time. Here it's important to remember that for Bentham, even though he says we're pleasure maximizers and pain avoiders, that doesn't mean that we're not ambivalent a lot. What does that mean? Bentham knows that whenever we're trying to decide what to do or whether to do something, there'll be a host of reasons for it and a host of reasons against it. You're trying to decide whether or not to get up and go to your 9:30 lecture class. And you're trying to decide whether to do that or just stay in bed and sleep and then study for another class. And you, as you calculate this in some kind of half-awake state, have lots of pleasures and pains potentially lined up on both sides. Pleasure. Sleep feels really good. You'll do better on your econ exam if you stay home and study for it rather than running off to class, whatever that class is. You might have time to exercise. It'll be a more leisurely morning. Everything about the idea seems appealing along those lines. But if you go to class, you might get something you need out of the lecture for writing your next paper. Or maybe your GSI will notice if you're not there and kind of think ill of you. Or if you go to class, you might even have some amazing insight. You might learn something in the middle of lecture. It's not guaranteed, but it might happen. So the point is that for Bentham, with every action, we're always, in a sense, involved in what is now going to be the principle of government. We're always trying to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I'm trying to get the most of these pulls and pushes about whether to go to class. I'm trying to figure out where I end up making the most happiness, trying to satisfy more of my desires, avoid more of my potential pains. Only now the application moves from the way that those pains and pleasures are lined up in a particular object or problem or possible action. It moves from that to literal individuals with multiple desires. So just as when thinking about whether to go to lecture or not, certain pleasures like sleeping would have to be sacrificed to achieve others, now the happiness of certain individuals may have to be sacrificed to the happiness of the majority. In other words, Bentham, unlike the social contract theorists, does not try to promise the happiness of all. We're too diverse for that. We don't all feel things in the same way. We don't all want the same things. So what we have to do is try to maximize the pleasure of the greatest number. So what are the legislators' tools here? Well, we're in a pleasure-pain calculus, so the legislator has to work on the level of human motivation. Give us carrots and sticks, or give us rewards or penalties. It doesn't have a lot to distribute in the way of rewards. So primarily legislation will deal in sanctions, pains, deprivations, to get us to behave in certain ways. And lots of these will be in the form of overt punishments. But Bentham's no great friend of punishment. He wants to make the good society without a lot of punishing, without dealing out a lot of pain, because he believes in pleasure maximization. So he has to turn to supplements, things that will get us to want things that comport with the whole and comport with the peacefulness and harmony of the whole that we wouldn't maybe want unless we were mildly or overtly coerced to want them. So what does he rely on? Public opinion, public morality, social norms. And he'll also rely on some direct social control through vast workshops of human activity. We're going to deal with those in a moment, but let me underscore how he's mobilizing the pulling on our pleasure-pain masters, the pulling on the strings of these masters that are inside of us to deal with the crucial democratic question. The question, namely, how does a utilitarian weigh the desires of the many against the welfare or the condition of the few? And what about the tyranny of the majority? And what about the sacrifice of the few? Or what if a majority wants to do something really hideous? Not just neglect the poor, but kill them. What if we're in Nazi Germany? Or other ethnic cleansing conditions? Or what if we're in the slave-holding South? This is a huge issue for utilitarians generally, not only for Bentham. And it's also precisely why utilitarianism almost has to be conjoined with programs of manipulation and social control to get us to want what is right. But first, let's hear this problem from Bentham. This is not in the text that you read. This is from his own Critique of Right, so I'll just read to you. Bentham says, the greatest enemies of public peace are the selfish and hostile passions. Necessary as they are, the one to the existence of each individual, the other to his security. So what's he telling us? We've got these enemies to public peace in us, selfish and hostile passions, the passions that have to do with preserving our existence and securing ourselves. But they're enemies, they're antisocial. Society is, he says, held together only by the sacrifice men can be induced to make of the gratifications they demand. So what's he telling us? We have to be induced to make sacrifices of the gratifications we desire. Freud's going to start with exactly the same problem when we get to him. To obtain these sacrifices, these sacrifices of the gratifications that we naturally demand, is the great difficult task of government, end quote. To obtain these sacrifices is the great difficult task of government. Okay, so let's be clear. We have a utilitarian who is no simple anti-government libertarian. But we also have here a far cry from the social contractarian view that government simply exists to secure our desires, to secure a safe and channeled and orderly place for us to pursue our desires. Here, Bentham is making clear that the task of government is to tame and sacrifice the hostile desires. They have to be tamed or harnessed or sacrificed. They have to be induced to sacrifice themselves. And we have to be rerouted in pursuing our happiness in socially viable directions. All right, so this original move Bentham made that seemed like, oh, that's pretty good, I just get to pursue my pleasure and avoid my pain, is now integrated into a project that's going to have a fair amount of social orchestration and control in it. What this means is that the utility principle at the level of government, the principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, which simply means figuring out what do the many want and what makes them happy, that utility principle will not take the many's desires as they are. It must shape them. And it can only do this by making the cost of gratifying those desires very painful. Okay, you can read more in the text itself about how Bentham actually makes the move to get this greatest good for the greatest number. All I've done so far is given you the outline of it. So we know that what we now do to get a principle of government is to take the utility principle, raise it to the level of collective, but add organizing and orchestrating and inducing and regulating us in ways that we often won't feel, through a combination of legislation and policy, as well as social opinion and social norms, to get us to want, as it were, the right things and abjure the wrong things. Okay, now we come to the real brilliance of Bentham. I think there's lots of brilliance in him, but I want to get to the Panopticon. And this will be where we conclude. The real brilliance of Bentham, in my view, is grasping that inducements to good behavior. Inducements to good behavior do not lie simply in rules and do not lie simply in systems of rewards and punishments. Rather, inducements to good behavior, getting us to be proper subjects in a mass society and want the right things and want things that don't create disorder and that make a productive society and that make the society as a whole run like machinery. That is achieved through an organization of space and systems of discipline that will penetrate to the very depths of the human being, that will remake us and our desires. What Bentham conceived in the Panopticon project, and that was the name of his prison project, his ideal or model prison, but it was much more than a prison. As I said, it was a system of social control and social reform that he ultimately imagined as addressing the entire underclass of England. And the aim would be, in this system, to make that underclass self-controlled, well-regulated, productive elements of society, rather than creatures who he thought at best littered the streets as paupers, and at worst constituted a kind of permanent threat to civility and society, and were then periodically locked up in these kind of horrible, inhumane paupers' prisons or other kinds of prisons, where their behavior, in his view, would only become worse. So the Panopticon is not just a structure. It is a structure, and I'll explain the I in a minute. It's not just a structure combined with a set of prison rules. It's a model for social control that has at its heart the disciplining of subjects, the surveillance of subjects, and the ability to transform subjects by having them see themselves as they are seen by the one who is surveilling them. What Bentham is going to promise is that, like utility, indeed as a form of utility, the Panopticon will bring these unruly subjects who have these wanton, undeveloped desires, antisocial desires. It will bring these subjects from the unproductive darkness of existing prison practices and existing streets into the light of total surveillance and the light of rational society. So the Panopticon project promises productivity and stability and rationality through this light. It's going to rescue from the darkness of unenlightened practices and existence. Okay, let's start with Panopticon. As Bentham himself tells you, it means everything seen, Panopticon. And Bentham introduces the Panopticon project on page 194 with a psalm from the Bible. And it's a really useful one. Tells you almost everything you need to know about this project. So let's do a brief reading of it. Bentham calls the Panopticon Papers. He says it's an outline of the plan of construction of a Panopticon penitentiary house. And then he offers this as its epigram. Now this, of course, the thou here in this psalm refers to God, but he is now going to be referring to the human one who is doing the watching, who is God-like in the prison. Thou art about my path and about my bed, and spiest all my ways. So, in the prison, nothing about the prisoner's movements or daily activities or ways of thought or feeling or even resting are going to escape surveillance ever. There will be no corners of privacy, nothing unseen. He continues, or God continues, or rather the psalm continues, if the darkness shall cover me, then shall my night be turned into day. In other words, there will be no moments of darkness in any sense of the word, nothing furtive, nothing forbidden, nothing hidden. But also, nothing cruel, nothing violent, nothing vile, nothing horrible. It continues, even there also shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. So the grip of God, or in this case, the grip of a model of moral rectitude, will never let loose, never leave the prisoner alone to his own thoughts or his own feelings. He's going to be totally occupied by the experience of the prison and of surveillance, and the norms will hold him too. It's going to be so occupying that eventually these norms, this surveillance, this way of watching will come inside him. They'll be completely, deeply internalized, so that eventually he watches himself as he is being watched from the outside. He internalizes the eye of the prison guard or reformer. Now, how does Bentham propose to accomplish this? Well, part of what he depends on is, as I suggested, the new tool of the age, an organization of space. The literal organization of the Panopticon is that it's a circular building, like this, in which all the cells face inward, and in which the prison tower or surveillance tower is in the middle. And Bentham also has in mind using a set of blinds. He doesn't have a way of describing it. We would say that's now kind of like a one-way window, or Venetian blinds is what he was trying to work with. He calls them blinds and other contrivances. So that no prisoner can see one another. All the prisoners are in their cells here. They can't see one another. And all can be seen by the surveillance from the middle. All can be seen from the watchtower. The watchtower is specially constructed so the keeper can see the prisoners, but the prisoners can't see him. And the aim, Bentham says, is to produce an invisible omnipresence, parallel to God's, an invisible omnipresence. He says, the functionary can conclude a survey of the whole establishment in a twinkling of an eye, can see every single prisoner. But note, this is light. There's light coming in from here. The whole prison is light. They're not thrown into cells of darkness. They're totally seen. They're totally exposed. They're totally surveyed instead of thrown down into a dark place. But they're being watched always, or imagined being watched always. So the watching eventually penetrates deep into the imagination, the psyche, the soul. One is so persistently and permanently watched that it totally occupies your consciousness. And this is how it comes to shape the subject, not just rule the subject. You're not ruled. You're just watched. In fact, there's no need, in Bentham's view, for the continuous presence of a guard to even be in that center. The tower itself simply represents the presence of that watching, that surveillance. Bentham also adds that the same cell must serve for all purposes: work, sleep, meals, punishment, devotion. So there's no differentiation in the surveyed and disciplined character of these activities. There's no break ever in one's experience of being a watched, disciplined subject. In addition, Bentham also has a plan of management, or a set of practices. He says, this is 199, prisoners will be adequately fed, kept warm, dressed neatly, provided medical care, and they'll be installed in a constant project or program of productive labor. Now, Bentham's Panopticon is often read as just a prison labor project, and it is that. He's understanding, among other things, how to make prisoners productive members of society, or we could say exploit them as laborers. But the productive labor, or as he puts it, profitable instruction, is also about transforming them. And each activity is to be part of a precise timetable. They're not going to be, as he puts it, left stewing or shivering in bed for 16 hours out of 24. So the prison becomes, as he puts it, converted into a school, and returning the inhabitants to society will return them to society reformed, transformed. Good, disciplinary, productive subjects who contribute to society, who watch themselves constantly as they were being watched, and have had that watching, that eye, replace their own. Now, what's Bentham proposing? Let me just conclude here. He's not simply proposing a way to make the prison experience more humane or more efficient. He's really trying to produce a different order of human beings. Human beings who were social throwaways, but now will be self-disciplined and productive, docile members of society. And he understands this isn't just a model for prisons and prisoners. It could be for the whole of society. It could be used, and he proposes, to put all the poor in the country under my management. So the model of control here is one that is as useful for schools. Think about the militarization of schools in poor neighborhoods. Think about the proposals that are often made to make kids of poverty into more disciplined and productive subjects. The way that Bentham is proposing to organize the mass, especially the mass that's been produced by capitalism and its inequalities, is by isolating, surveying, and correcting individuals, terrorizing them without touching them, transforming them without dominating them through despotism. This practice is, as some of you know, absolutely ubiquitous in welfare practices today. It's exactly how visits by social workers into homes that inspect cleanliness and child-rearing practices and the sexual order of things work. It's also how surveillance cameras work. Think about what you know. When you walk into a place and you see a surveillance camera, you don't know if it's on or not. You don't know if anybody's watching it or not. You're watching it watch you, and you know you're being watched. In educational practices, where the timetable of activities is precise and detailed, where there's no privacy or solitude, where an enormous mass of individuals is trained and measured and ordered according to standards like MCATs and SATs and so forth that rank and regulate you. This is what Bentham is detailing shamelessly: the mechanisms and the aims of a fully controlled and administered society in which we feel free and we are constantly maximizing our pleasures, but in which our pleasures and pains have been orchestrated, constructed, controlled, produced through a series of rules and laws and spatial organizations and administrations, so that we're not controlled by the terrible threats of an abusive monarch or slave master. We're not even controlled mainly by rules. We're controlled by a social system of discipline and surveillance that each of us is meant to internalize, that becomes part of our consciousness at the very deepest levels. This social system has at its heart the moral norms, not just of pleasure and pain, but productivity. That's also what Bentham's after here, is to get productivity at the heart of the matter. So the order that he's forecasting isn't just one of regulated, rule-bound behavior, but of a deep conformity achieved by the overwhelming power of public opinion and the value of being productive members of society. So that's how utilitarianism, which works through those two sovereign masters, becomes a global order of servitude and regulation and control. We have 4 minutes for questions. And I'm sorry, I had to get all of Bentham into one session. But we'll slow down next time when we do Mill. But just take 4 minutes if you have questions. Yeah? Do you want me to say a little more about that? Yeah. Okay. So the question is, how is it that we see Bentham in a more neoliberal condition rather than in this classic social contract? So, or in what we could call liberal democracy. So in liberal democracy, we could say that however much we are ordered by capitalism at the economic level, the principles in liberal democracy that are meant to govern us are equality, political freedom and rights, and a certain constitutionalism. And what I'm suggesting is that as market metrics come to displace those to some degree, and we are increasingly in an order where the values that organize the state and organize politics are efficiency, maximizing utility, and the question of what works rather than what is right or what is the good. I'm suggesting that utilitarianism actually really comes to the fore in a certain way, that the question of what's the best way to administer a society or undertake a war or achieve a certain economic health, push to one side the values that we take as given in a liberal democracy, what has to be first and foremost, constitutional values, but also basic principles of justice, and push those aside in somewhat the same way that Bentham does, as the question of how to get something done, what really works, comes to be predominant. Yeah?
So it seems like there's this tension between Bentham arguing for the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and emphasis on the later part, greater number, and then also him claiming the necessity of the state to go and regulate its subjects. And it seems like this sort of tension between, on the one hand, kind of the sort of democratic aspiration of utilitarianism, for a great number of people, and then on the other hand, giving power to the state to regulate subjects.
So I agree that tension is there potentially, and we'll really see it in Mill. Mill really seizes on that tension. Bentham, I think, thinks that he has found a way to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number via the mechanism of a great deal of state administration and control. And it's not just any state administration and control. It's state administration and control that produces our felt happiness as well-behaved members of society. So instead of just taking us and saying, well, have your freedom, have your liberty, pursue what pleasure you want and avoid what pain you can't stand, he says, to get us all to live well together and make society productive and make this thing cohere, I am going to have to organize some of your pleasures for you. But once I've done that, you won't miss anything. You'll be fine. You're happy. You're all achievers. You all got here. It didn't take anything out of you. You're getting what you want. And so I think Bentham is less attuned to that tension than John Stuart Mill will be. He'll be attuned to it, but precisely because he's attuned to it and wants to hang on to utilitarianism, the theory is just going to be wildly messy. I actually think there's more consistency in Bentham because he's shameless about his willingness to administer social controls, to make as many of us happy and make society hum along as peacefully as he can and bring the bottom up and make us a productive order. And Mill's going to be much more torn between individual liberty and the mess that makes for the many who actually have very little ability to use their liberty in ways that is very elevating. Okay, Mill on Thursday. Please, again, look at the CNN segment and we'll talk about your papers on Thursday.